Rufus Pollock, welcome to Radio Evolve. I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you, Thomas. It's a real pleasure to be talking with you today.
Rufus, you are doing a lot of things. You have science background, economic background, but you created an organization that's called Life Itself. And as far as I understand, you see this organization as being part of a bigger movement that's happening right now, where people try to find new forms of life practices, living together, and new angles on our reality that allows us to respond to the crisis of our time. Can you just say in some words what motivated you to create Life Itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and first I want to say that I'm a co-founder, and very much it's a collaborative endeavor. In particular, my actual life partner was a co-founder, Sylvie Barbier, who's a performance artist, and many others, and a kind of visionary curator, and Liam Kavanagh, and there've been also a large number of other people. So I just want to acknowledge the kind of ancestors, my collaborators, all the people who've contributed to this coming to fruition. You asked a little bit about my path specifically to it, I think. And I guess I don't want to go back too far, but certainly since, you know, I'm about to turn 42, over 25 years since my teenage years, I had kind of a strong interest, I guess, in two areas. One was in consciousness. When I was 13 or 14, I was reading neuroscience textbooks, and I got into Zen Buddhism and meditation in my late teens. And I am a Zen Buddhist. I've been practicing now meditation for about 22 years. And then the other was in social change, like how it was so visible, even at the simplest level of the playground, as a child, of how we treated each other, how the fat kid or the kid with glasses or the person who was this or that or me would get, excluded or included, or how it would go. And the kind of injustice and the suffering was viscerally present to me as a child. I think now, like, I'm on the autistic spectrum, and what would be called, in the old days, Asperger's. And I didn't know that though as a child, but I really had this sense of like, there's something not right here. And then more visibly in wider society as I got older. And so those two channels or kind of inclinations or pulls in me have always been looking to somehow connect. And for a while I worked more in, I'd call, like, systemic change. I did a lot of work around the information society, how we regulate this world, or how we run this world made of bits rather than atoms. But really, I think I was always knew that in my heart, the real change that we need, the real transformation we need, has to have a kind of primacy of our being, of our culture, of our inner world. And so that's what really brought me to found or co-found Life Itself in 2015, 2016, which was about making a radically wiser and weller world, and particularly wiser. Like, this was not a term that I worked in philanthropy, I worked in areas with philanthropy. People don't really say that with a straight face, but that's what we need, is a wiser, more awakened, more integral, waking up, cleaning up, growing up, showing up world.
Cool. Life Itself seems to be part of something that I perceive as a bigger movement. There are, particularly in the younger generation, a lot of initiatives to live together, to practice together, to work together, and to do this with a focus on consciousness and culture at the same time. First, do you perceive the same bigger movement as happening, and how do you interpret it? What's going on here?
Well, I think that's a really fascinating and great question, Thomas. So, first of all, at the first gatherings of Life Itself, like in 2016, I remember I at least was involved in a presentation about what I called co-X, like co-living, co-working, co-creating. There's all this and there was this sense that just even that area of something bubbling up. So I think there really is something happening here. We don't know what it is, as the song goes. I think, to answer the specific question, there's like a big kind of historical question, then there's kind of a factual question: is there something happening? And I could also point, we've been involved in even an ecosystem mapping project at Life Itself that kind of starts to document this and try and sense what that is. I've always been fascinated by the 60s, which I think obviously stuff happened after the 60s with the last great bubbling up of some kind of something that was certainly very visible as a kind of radical or intriguing shift. So to answer, I think one, there is real evidence. I think you can document that in even attitudes. One of the, I think, great drivers is just this foundational breaking down that's becoming so visible, that people spoke to for 50 years or longer, but in the climate crisis, in the political crisis, in the sense of the consensus of neoliberal capitalism or whatever is really breaking down. There's inequality, democracy is not functioning very well. There are these really visible stresses and dysfunction of the systems in which we've been in. And I think the second part of that for people is that while that may have been there before, there was a sense maybe it was going to get patched. There was some kind of relatively minor corrections that were going to get made. We were going to do some more redistribution of wealth, tax system was going to get reformed, or we would do this or that. And I think there's a real sense, especially amongst younger generation, that something is really wrong, and it's wrong foundationally. And that also turning into a cynicism, and to some degree at the beginning hopelessness, and then a sense also of, in a small areas of real then possibility for a foundational shift. Because sadly with humans, it seems that we're not yet wise enough to always, we need to hurt ourselves to take action on something a little bit. Unfortunately, it doesn't yet. I hope we will be wise enough that we won't have to get too hurt. But that aspect of something really visibly not working seems to be key to a sort of kind of waking up for ourselves. So to answer you, yes, I think something's happening. I think it's also a generational thing to finish, which is we are 2 generations from the 60s or 70s. So that's kind of the pendulum swings back. These other reasons.
Let me talk to that, because you say the pendulum is kind of swinging back, and there's some reason to think that way. At the same time, it's not swinging back; it's also swinging to a new place.
Yes,
what's the new place that it's swinging to, as far as you can see it?
Well, I think I want to distinguish, just in answering that in humility.
Mm-hmm.
One is, I don't think we're ever going to exactly know, in the sense that I think I just want to really start with this humility of that it's an experiment, and one can have, and also to distinguish what one would like from what will happen. And those two are linked. If enough of us want something, then we go that way. I think on the positive, on the best version of it, I mean, it is, if we could take an integral perspective here, or just a general kind of cultural evolutionary perspective, that in human history there have been these kind of breakthroughs. And I can mention here this idea that we've been talking about, Life Itself, of a second Renaissance. Clearly in what we could call the breakthrough to modernity, there was the Middle Ages, we had the Renaissance beginning, and over a long period of time, hundreds of years, a new kind of consciousness, a new way of seeing the world, a new way of understanding ourselves as human beings, of seeing our place in the cosmos, new techniques of understanding, of epistemology, of new kind of ontology came forth. I think that we're in that kind of moment potentially, and my hope is that could happen. And to describe some features of that, I think this is really, I just want to obviously acknowledge the influence of Wilber and Integral and many, and for me also of Buddhism and so on. One, I think that's really important is this idea of that we can grow in an inner way. So we, in modernity, if you like, modernity, in a crude sense at least, almost economically and socially became about material growth in its reductionist version. I mean, it does, there are many other wonderful things in modernity. I don't want, and that there was a good things about material growth, let's be really clear. But that sort of became its focus, at least in how we satisfied our wants, how we became, you know, like economics is the kind of reduction of that, of like we're, you know, you've got these infinite wants and you're going to try and satisfy them with as much, you know, eat as much ice cream or have as many cars, or, you know, it's kind of more is good of material stuff. And so I think the single biggest potential change in this second Renaissance is this shift to see the growth of our inner, of ourselves, kind of in our inner selves, our being and our collective being. And of course, those two things are not separable. They're not cleanly separable. The individual and the collective, we're sort of interwoven. I think that is a really, and that's one of the things that I think that you do see more and more people seeing and acknowledging. Like no one can sit there really now and think, wow, if we multiply GDP, even if it was feasible, by 10 times, you know, I don't know, we have 500,000 GDP per capita, you know, something, that people would be that much happier, you know. It's at the personal level, the futility of that model, the kind of the end game of that model is visible, let alone its impact on the planet. And then on the kind of collective level, the dysfunction of that is very visible. So we really need the shift. And I think that's really visible to people now. And I think that's one really key aspect of the future, and that Wilber really speaks about, but I think it's crucial. I call that the kind of the shift to an ontological politics. We've had a material politics, a politics focused and an economy focused on how do we make more stuff? How do we distribute that stuff? To how do we cultivate the being? And then you have to come to how that would come about. Yeah,
say more about that. What is an ontological politics? That sounds
well, I think it's a bit of a fancy term, right? The word ontology, but it in Greek just means being. And given we still live in an era with a lot of allergy to the word, maybe we could say spiritual. I like the word ontological because it kind of covers psychology, the spiritual, whatever you would, even I would even call it the cultural collective. So what I mean by ontological politics is that shift to a politics focused on being, and also on a double level, both that being is a major, I don't want to say the goal, the focus of political effort, right? Because every society, politics, what I mean in this sense is how do we collectively organize society together? Every society has an explicit or implicit sense of possibility for human beings and how to pursue that, whether it's stated out loud or not. We can go back to Plato's Republic, we can go through to the modern day. And as I said, in the modern day, the economist is God. You know, really, that is, in a way, that thinking dominates late modernity. And it's profoundly dysfunctional. I mean, it has great, good things. I was an economist but it's in a way of seeing human beings as atomized individuals, as with these fixed preferences, as largely, you know, being this kind of like, how can we just maximize? That is one view. And then an ontological politics is one, to acknowledge the ontological base of all politics, i.e. that we always have a view of human beings. Secondly, to put the development of our being and the cultivation of our culture as a central goal of political effort versus getting more stuff. And to also see, finally, that of the wicked problems we face, which is the other key aspect of political action, which is addressing things which are essentially collective, the climate crisis. I mean, many how we organize society together, but particularly things which require collective action, that the ontological root of those. So we live in, again, just take an example of the climate crisis, many of the times, most of the discourse we see is like, oh, what's the technological solution? Or even if you're lucky, what's the governance solution? But rarely is it, what's the ontological solution? What is it in the way that we see the world and that we relate to each other, and that we are, that is at the source of this crisis, and what would we need to transform in that to deal with this crisis powerfully?
It's interesting. I mean, let's go there because everyone can relate to what is the technological solution to the climate crisis, what is the political solution to that, even what is the cultural solution to that. But when you say ontological solutions, what are you looking at? Not what are the solutions already, maybe we go there also, but what's a different perspective that's opening up when you're looking for that?
Right. Well, so, I mean, by the way, first on the ontological includes the personal and the collective, which would be called cultural. Mm-hmm. So when we see, just take one example, is in modernity, even pre-modernity, like nature's something to be kind of have dominion over. Like, in the Bible, it says that. And you even read, like, let's say you go read back to the 60s even, and you read Marcuse and One Dimensional Man, this Bible of like Marxist critique, of consumer. He still talks about nature as something to kind of be exploited and dominated. And that is the view that one lived in. Now, when you say, so first of all, just to see the profound roots of separation and the way that nature is seen, as this sort of kind of resource to be used however we wish. And then that would have to shift. You'd have to come from a perspective into being, of interdependence, of some understanding of ourselves as part of nature, as opposed to apart from it. Some of these things I'm saying are cliche, but what I want to emphasize about them is they're so easy to say, and it's a profound thing. And I'm not claiming myself even, to really live that way, to really live in an understanding of our interwovenness with each other, with nature, with the cosmos, and to act in that way.
If I understand you right, and I agree with you, that's easy to misunderstand because it easily sounds like a cliche kind of interbeing, be with, but it's so easy to miss, and I think that's what you're getting at, how we, by our second nature, have an instrumental relationship to everything.
Yes.
So that, and it has to do somehow how we are in the world, how we show up.
Yes.
Which has to do with our modern understanding of subjectivity and objectivity, that I'm a subject and everything are objects we can deal with and we can optimize. And that in itself is so close to us that we don't see it.
It's the water in which we swim, and it's why exactly it's the water to the fish. We swim in assumptions about the kind of the nature of being for human beings, to put it in a Heideggerian, or another example that I will want to cite is like Earhart and Werner Earhart and Landmark. I mean, the superstition of I. He has a whole wonderful talk, which is again a core tenet of Buddhism. We walk around like I Rufus, I this, I that, where there's like, what is this I? I'm just saying ontology, and why this is profoundly important even for society. If I really acknowledge the Rufus I, the things I want or think, are so much given by what I mean, they're not kind of mine. There isn't some essential Rufus but I'm given by the advertising I've watched, by the books I've read, by the culture I've imbibed, by the encounters I've had. It really calls into question, for example, the sacred cows of liberal capitalism, like I'm a consumer, I choose what I want. I used to have these endless arguments with my father about advertising. My father's convinced he was a very smart man. He was convinced he wasn't influenced by advertising. And I was just like, are you joking? These people very intelligent people spend billions of dollars and they have no influence. Like, try and find me someone who acknowledges their influence by advertising. But this is the point in Buddhist thought and in an ontological, that's totally accepted. Now, and again, even let's take a more sacred cow. So you know what you want, so you get to vote. Now, two of the core things of modernity, democracy and the free market, in a way, are founded on these deep ontological suppositions of me as some atomic individual who knows what I want, who has preferences, which somehow just arrived here. Once you question that, you're like, wow, well, that's a kind of, now you've got to be subtle. We're not saying anything that went down the route of kind of, I want to be clear, of Marxist paternalism, you know, like that you kind of, you don't know what you want because you've got the false consciousness story. But there's a line to walk here, which is common, like commitment without attachment in Buddhism. There's a place to be that isn't attached, but isn't detached. Similarly, there's a place to acknowledge that the non-selfness, that the arising of our preferences and how that came to be, and therefore how that we should be wise about cultivating them without falling into that means someone else knows for me. And that's, again, just to cite two sites, there's a wonderful talk by Thich Nhat Hanh called Technology is Horse. So he's gone to Google and he's trying to talk with Google about how they should, well, how they should maybe, they're asking what can we do to make, technology addiction, address it and so on. And he starts talking about the teaching of Buddhism that, a little bit about this. One of the things is like, hey, if we started putting things into apps that, for example, didn't show you notifications all the time, we're kind of interfering with people's consumer sovereignty, this engineer says. And Thich Nhat Hanh really says to them, people don't know that. What are you talking about? Like, kind of in a way, it's not like you know what you want. That's a really deep practice to really know what you want. And the guy's a bit shocked. And now it's a subtle point, as I said. It's not saying that therefore Thich Nhat Hanh knows better, but it is saying that maybe he or there are traditions which teach us paths where we can cultivate the ability to truly know what we want, for example. And again, to one other story is famously the Buddha of, this cow that has this disease and all its skin is rotting off. And whenever it stands next to a tree, all these insects come out and eat its flesh. And whenever it stands next to a wall, the insects come out of the wall and eat its flesh. And the Buddha says, that's you. That is you and what you consume with your mind and your body. You are that cow. So you should be really thoughtful about what you consume. And that, again, when you come to ontological politics, just take me one common example. In a world of true ontological politics, I can't imagine advertising being permitted in the way it is today. Just one very concrete example.
Well, that's powerful. And I really would like to focus on something that, listening to you, I find more and more fascinating, which is the combination of the two words that you're using, ontological politics, which both have Greek roots. One is being, and the other is the polis. It's the way we live together.
The city, yeah, the community.
The city. And where you seem to come from seems to be very also inspired by what we call the mindfulness movement of the last 30 years, which Thich Nhat Hanh, although he didn't associate himself with that, is a big representative of it in some way, which is not just Buddhism, but it's also Buddhist influenced. This mindfulness, which in itself is already very much what you call ontological. It's basically breaking open our ontological foundations by being mindful and being aware that maybe my eye sense is not as I think it is if I don't let go. But you put it together with politics, which is the way how we live together. And with politics, I would like to go polis in all sizes. Polis in the sizes of how we live together in communities, how we live together in our regions, and how we live together in our nation states, and how we live together on this planet. But it's the question how we live together and how we organize our living together. So there's something that seems to me a step beyond what the mindfulness movements did in the last 30 years, bringing these two dimensions together and asking the question, how can we think this as one? Yes. And I think what's happening, also how we started the conversation, people kind of trying to find new ways to live and work together, is very inspired by this two, making one out of them.
Absolutely. And I think two things. Well, in the implicit question, I mean, one about the mindfulness movement, which is, I think, so there's just amazing things about that. I think in some people can now mean it to become a sort of either a kind of denatured, in the sense it's been taken from its kind of ethical or spiritual context and become, you can become mindful while learning to be a better sniper. Kind of it could be it can become simply a psychotechnology without the wisdom context. I mean, almost to reference, I think, Viveki a little bit in that, like any set of practice like that wants to, I think, and again, like Thich Nhat Hanh would say this very strongly, and others, wants to be embedded in an ethical, cultural, and kind of spiritual tradition. I would suggest an ontological tradition, as opposed. And I think the other thing is maybe it's become quite individual in the West. And what I really hear, and I think you're so right, is that the collective is crucial here. And again, relates to the politics, but more generally, I could say for at least 2 or 3 reasons, I think it's important. One is that if we were just even focused on what we could call kind of left quadrants integral, or inner, or even upper left, inner experience, actually a lot of that growth requires the interaction in the collective. The challenge is, so much of my shadow, so much of my reactivity of me personally, Rufus, has shown up in the collective. Having to cook together, or having to interact with others who are different from me. That is, in terms of our growth, I really think there is a limit to some extent of one's, at least cleaning up growth, even waking up growth in others, if without a collective kind of interaction and even collective practice.
And if I may respond to that, in this connection of these 2 dimensions, the being and the polis dimension, the kind of mindfulness and the, if I may say so, being in the world together dimension. In some sense, also, at least to my understanding, goes beyond Buddhism in some way. And I know Thich Nhat Hanh went, in my sense, a little beyond Buddhism, because Buddhism, in its origins, is very much focused on the liberation of the individual in that. And there is something where it's not kind of how do we organize our living together in that sense. It was not the main focus. Thich Nhat Hanh would not agree with me, but I would see it that way. But what I find is happening right now is exactly kind of with the foundations of mindfulness and everything, to really enter the collective space and see how this changes our being together in the world. It's not just transcending the world. There's an element of transcending the world, which you touched on.
Absolutely.
But there is also immanence in really arriving in the world and finding a way how to live together. And by the way, finding a way how to deal with things like the climate change.
Yeah, so I think really to build on that and to agree with it, a key point of, let's say, ontological politics, or even of life itself, is it's like you kind of need the both. You need the presence and the purpose. You need the being in the world. You need the individual and the collective. You really also need the inner transformation, and you need complex systems work, or you need governance change, or you need to go and engage in politics. We need the both and. And I think one point I don't need to go into in depth is that, at least, I don't think that necessarily Buddhism was necessarily about individual liberation, because in Buddhism there wouldn't necessarily be an individual. But I think there's a point which is, it didn't have a political program. It wasn't like Buddha wrote, the Republic as well as the sutras. Now I think there are good reasons for that. Tradition, when Buddha was asked by kings for kind of advice about how to run their kingdoms, I think quite intelligently sometimes he kind of declined, at least according to whatever stories we have, or gave general advice of like, be wise, follow right the eightfold path. And I think that you're right, that right now there's this incredible opportunity of integration of these things, and even in ontological politics, this coming together of several thousand years of what you most could call scientific phenomenology, scientific ontology of modern cognitive science, of our understanding of human beings, and of political thought and social and economic thought about how to organize society, and coming together at several levels. So first of all, that all of the progress we have made technologically and so on has enabled new opportunities for how we organize society. Even this very cool right now that I am speaking to you over hundreds or thousands of kilometers with this technology, this is a radical, to come now very concrete. If we want to build more collectives, a classic problem has been, hey, since even the 60s or before, you know, I've done a relatively extensive study of communes and intentional communities over the last 200 years. Your big problem is you have to move somewhere. And generally, for a variety of economic reasons, that generally meant the middle of nowhere. That meant generally you were involved in farming, which for most people turned out to be harder than they thought. So one of the just radical opportunities right now is we can come together and work without necessarily having to come together in person. So this opens up huge vistas for collaboration, for forming intentional communities or collectives who want to engage in kind of, I would call it both inner and outer development or experimentation. That's just huge. I mean, I think this is bigger than it's bigger than the railway. It's bigger than many of the changes in physical or technological communication in human history. And COVID obviously in some ways helped us see that, even for all the challenges, also see that. And that's just, but that, and so what I would say, these coming together, this interweaving of what this fruition of this inner work from the East and West and this outer work. And that's also that comes back to that term, the second Renaissance, which I owe a little bit to Francesco Varela, where he was pointing like, you know, in the 14th, 15th century, it was rediscovering the Greeks, the Romans, the authors of antiquity in the West. And this Renaissance is a flowering of suddenly the West has in a way got to encounter Eastern, I would call them empirical ontology of 2,500 years that went the right route. That, you know, unfortunately the Western tradition, and we could go off here, but the Western philosophical tradition went down kind of major mistake, I think, was the Socratics and Plato that Heidegger talks about. And I think that, you know, the East kind of got right in understanding key points about the nature of human beings and reality that make a really big difference to how we see the world, like the interbeing point that we talked about non-duality and so on. And that is this flowering of the second Renaissance, a chance for, you know, faith and science to come back together and all kinds of things that we see happening in even, you know, cognitive science and, you know, Buddhism and other traditions. And then practically at the level of what we can create, you know, the great failure, I want to say, of the 60s was, I think it was ontologically very immature. It kind of thought, hey, it's capitalism, man, that's oppressing, or whatever it is. We're just going to go and form our commune, and then it's going to work out. We're going to have got rid of the whatever it is, the alienation or the oppression, and now we're all just going to like hold hands and sing Kumbaya, which is an exaggeration, but it was in that sense often lacking.
No, it's interesting that you're going there, because I thought about this right now as you were talking. There was a split in the 60s.
Yes.
There was a split between the political 60s and the spiritual 60s. And they went very, very different routes. One went to India, and the other basically organized the May Revolution in Paris or something like that. They were at odds with each other. I mean, there were overlaps, but basically they were very separate. One was about organizing society in a neo-Marxist understanding mostly. The other was a rediscovery of internality in discovering the East, in going to India, and going to the East, meditating and doing all kind of mistakes happened on all levels, and a lot of things went wrong. But somehow one also could make the argument that the second Renaissance that you're talking has its roots there.
Absolutely.
But something needed time with its own failures to find a level of integration that's only possible now.
I think that's such a brilliant point. And I'd say, you know, you go back again, to even the Renaissance, what we now know, Thomas Aquinas, the high point of medieval scholasticism was pretty close. And we now know we're actually reading some of the texts via Spain, and the Arabs were already had some early access to, obviously. So I think that I'm just reiterating that the roots of, I think, what is coming had those seeds. And you're right, it took time to mature. And I think one of the points maybe to build on that is what separated. And while it's not going back to maybe the Marxist or the naive, like we're just going to form a commune and it's going to be egalitarian somehow, those experiments may need to happen on both sides, and both things had incredible strengths and weaknesses. I think one was kind of naive and didn't have enough inner work, and the other became didn't see, maybe lost touch with what we would need in broader social change. But in an integrated sense, an integral perspective, we're in a moment where they can be woven back together in a really powerful whole, potentially. Ontological politics, if you like.
Yeah. Because one could also talk about what you say, ontological politics, and turn around and could say it's collective mindfulness.
Yeah.
It's somehow pointing at least in the same direction. And that seems to what is happening right now on many levels. There is a whole new development. I mean, what we are working in Evolve is part of this, of a collective mindfulness, kind of we spaces that are able to be beyond the object-subject divide and create a synergy by being present in a different way. And there are many other places where this happens. So it seems to be a movement in culture that something wants to form here, and also try to find its own form. And the different laboratories who try, and something will work and something won't work. And in 30 years, we'll know more what worked and what didn't work in all that. But we are in the midst of finding ways to also learn from what we have learned in the last 30 years, because I think the mindfulness movement was the initial dismantling of the Western ontology, I would say.
Yes.
The whole Descartesian identity that we created and that defines us as modern people, the seed of dismantling was already on the meditation cushions that many people for now many years sat on, also with many failures and whatever. It's not an ideal thing. That it's reality. A lot of mistakes happen all the time, but something was born there that we now stand on and can work with, that allows us to have a different, use your word, ontology in dealing with what we have to deal with, how we live in this world together.
Absolutely. I mean, to put it, Descartes made this incredible tiny trap, which is the I, the lie that is I think, therefore I am. What he should have said, there is doubting, or there is awareness, or these things. And that's what we've got out of, and then start to see the unfolding of. I think what I want to, maybe, if it's okay, build on there is to say, first of all, yes, there's this sense of the collective mindfulness or the ontological politics, this weaving together. And to mention even one in the practice, I know, like emergent dialogue, I think this combination, you can see it there, of the presence, but also able to hold purpose without it kind of becoming a getting somewhere, which is another great curse of myself and maybe the West. I could say, we've got to get somewhere, we've got to fix something, we've got to resolve it. And the point you mentioned about experimentation. So one of the big questions then is, how does this happen? It, as I said, the history is littered, unfortunately, with these failures of intentional communities or experiments to kind of pioneer the future. How can we do better without it being a grasping, like we've got to do better, we've got to engineer it? But like a gardener, I would like to say, a gardener is both experimenting, it's a craft, and we do learn from experience. We do know that, oh, this soil is alkali, so these kind of plants will grow here. This soil is acidic, so these kind of plants will grow here. One of the really big points, I think, right now is to think for ourselves about that kind of what ecology of practices, what are the ways that we just need to economically try and structure things. I said, many communities or experiments or efforts break down for simple financial reasons in a way. They can't sustain themselves. What can we learn? What patterns, what practices can we share? And as I said, I like that word ecology. How do they fit together? And that I think is something that I am intensely interested in, and I'm intensely interested to learn from, and also to share the learnings that we've had so far around that area, but most importantly, to try and discover others, and to try and even, I don't want to say, at least collect those insights as they're coming up.
No, that's powerful. And that relates to what John Vervaeke and others call ecology of practices.
Yes.
I think it also relates to what you said before about this amazing new possibility because of the internet.
Yes.
Because all of us, we are limited. We only can do a limited whatever. But because of this completely different form of communication and being together, we are in a way where we can do, let's say, our thing, whatever this is, maybe body practice, maybe a community building, maybe dialogical practice, maybe a new form of system thinking, maybe whatever. But we can connect dialogically and weave it so that nobody of us holds it. There is an ecology of practices, means that it's a living system that becomes a whole. And what people like Jordan Hall call distributed meaning making means exactly that none of us has to hold the whole meaning. We can do both at the same time, do our thing, but in an informed way, and learn and find how we create synergy between all of that. And I feel this movement of different communities, of different people working together, and also this movement that I see on online conversations like this, which is a completely new thing in the cultural history of humanity, that we can have deep conversations like this just on a snap, and we can connect without traveling, and we can learn. And there's a completely different situation that we just have to really understand what the possibility is, and that this is one of a possible foundation of what you call the second Renaissance.
Yes, yes, totally. And to the key, I think, is to recognize we really also, to come back to the primacy of being point, i.e., if you want to think of it for people who are integral familiar, it'd be like the primacy of the left quadrants. That technology makes so much possible, but without the work, whether you're in a group physically co-located or whether you're on the internet, the same breakdowns can happen of collective sense making, which, so that, and so it makes so much possible. And it's like that has gone up. So we also need to kind of really practice on the side of the inner side, because one of the things I think that's really critical to understand I think for myself is our kind of mind addiction, and our addiction to, I would call it structural technological fixes. So what's just in simple things that, whether one is living together, one's work collectively online, how does one, that's amazing. And still the same kind of challenges are going to come up in like, how do we deal with disagreement? How do we deal with decisions? How do we make, when we do this like distributed cognition, how do I know when to kind of like delegate my viewpoint on X to somebody else or not? These really the analogy I always give that I think that we don't yet have is the way we've scaled a lot of that in our societies is by creating, well, I mean, Weber would put it this way, creating rational structures. We measure things, we have rules about them. It seems to me that in the second Renaissance, part of it is some thing, as we say, I like the term gardening, or even I sometimes think medicine is like this. People think medicine is actually more scientific than it is. There is obviously a load of science in medicine, but there's a huge amount of judgment and expertise in it. Or even being a lawyer is a good example, whatever, but gardening is a good, there's clearly science informs it, but it's a kind of craft. Or Zen masters. There is not a checklist by which you decide someone is a Zen master or Zen mistress. You don't say, okay, like here you come to the exam. Oh yes, you check that, you check that. It's somehow determined by this community of practice that approves others. And why I say this is as we try to weave, and there's a lot of discussion in our sense space about how do we do collective sense making, but it shows up in how do we make collective choices within a group or community, which are the things that they break down so frequently about. How do we do that? And it comes back also to really challenging things. I think is one of the most central and brilliant things, but is most challenging in Wilber's point about growth versus dominator hierarchies. How do we understand or deal with people who have more expertise? How do we acknowledge that? How do we weave that together? And why I mention this again at the end is because it's one of the things that's hard ontologically, and also what a load of politics has been about. How, Plato's the first work that we have of kind of political theory basically has a sort of dictatorship of these experts, the philosopher kings, which we all, often has been, through to popular today, has been critiqued as the beginning of authoritarianism and kind of totalitarianism. And then the other way we've gone of kind of radical egalitarian democracy is also dysfunctional, I think, a lot of the time in actually running things. And it's why most things, most organizations don't actually run as radical egalitarian democracies. And I do think the path out of that, it's like the mind-body problem. Mm-hmm. The mind-body problem sort of dissolves when you move to another level. The kind of the duality problem no longer, it shows up in scientific materialism. But as you transcend scientific materialism, it sort of dissolves away. And similarly, this really profound political problem, which is how do we sort of have efficiency or just recognize the different capabilities or, and delegate and so on. But then how did we stop that becoming, going bad, becoming authoritarian or bureaucratic or sclerotic? The way to there's no governance hack. There's no clever way to fix the system, but there is a way that the system combined with ontological growth can transform that. And the crudest way to think that is imagine a world inhabited where we're all sort of Buddhas. Well, we could imagine very different ways of organizing and running society in that world than we could right now. I'm not saying we have to wait for that. There's a dance. We're constantly in evolution. New stages of being enable new ways of organizing, just as the way that people started thinking about human beings allowed the French Revolution. I mean, or the good things of the French Revolution. What I mean is, the kind of epitome of modernity: liberty, equality, fraternity. And I always joke that that was modernity's motto: liberté, égalité, fraternité, and what it should be the motto of whatever comes next, of the second Renaissance or what metamodernism, or whatever you call it. I always, liberation, true liberation, equanimity, and kind of, I don't know what you'd call the collective, but that the kind of interbeing. So that was the motto of what comes. Liberation, equanimity, and interbeing.
Well, it's called in connection of the American Revolution. People talk also how the American Revolution was a declaration of independence, and what we now need is a declaration of interdependence.
Exactly. Yeah, the weaving together again of rights and responsibilities and these things. And I think that's, to finish, that's why also, and what maybe at life itself, like one of the things at the micro level is we need to do these experiments and how we work and live together and really try them. That's where the rubber hits the road. That's where we can try out our ecology of practices. And that's where what can sound like really great things to say become daily encounters, daily practices, daily learning. And I think we have a unique opportunity. So actually, so far in human history, for the technological reasons, for cultural reasons, for ontological reasons, for social and economic reasons, why that is possible, and also why it is essential in this moment of profound crisis as well.
Thank you, Rufus. Thank you very much.